right, this is Professor Hildebrandt. This is the second in a three-part series of lectures on Chapter 6, Tracking the U.S. Economy for Macroeconomics. In this second video, I'm going to be looking at the circular flow the circular flow model. So if you can recall from Chapter 1, we had a very basic circular flow where we said we had households over here, we had firms on the other side, we had a resource market where resources were exchanged, and then we had a product market. And we talked about how resources flowed through the economy. We talked about how dollars would flow, right? And so there was this back and forth kind of relationship between all of these things. So we're going to just take that basic, simple model and we're going to expand it here in Chapter 6. And this is what it looks like. So the model's name is the circular flow of income and expenditure. I know at first glance it probably looks like a lot, but I'm going to really break these down and go through step by step. So we're going to start right here. See the number 1? That's where we're going to start, okay? So we start with our firms, right? Our firms have purchased resources, transformed them through the process of production into goods and services, okay? That's the role of the firm. So let's start with that first part. And let me kind of divide this out. So the bottom half of our model is the income part of the flow. And then the top half, sorry guys, is the expenditure. Okay, so we start with the firms purchasing those resources that they need in order to produce their goods and services. Well, they have to pay for those resources, so that generates income. And remember, when we're talking about all the income earned from all the production, we call it aggregate income. And what we should find, again, going back to the first part of this chapter, because one person's income equals another person's spending, our aggregate income will equal our GDP. So that those dollars start flowing through the income circle. Anytime we have an arrow leaving the circle, like this one, that is called a leakage. And you'll see several of those throughout the circle. So taxes are dollars that leak away from our income flow, right? We don't get to keep all of the income that we earn. We have to pay taxes. Where does the tax dollars go? Those tax dollars go to the government. Now, the government does quite a few things with the tax dollars, but one of the things it does generates income for other households. We've talked about this in Chapter 3, those transfer payments, right? Redistribution. Remember, that's what I called it, a redistribution of income. Redistribution of income. And so we could have things like Pell Grant for students, Medicare, Medicaid for medical expenses, unemployment insurance, Social Security. All of those are examples of transfer payments. So those dollars go back into the income flow. Whenever that happens, we call it an injection. So we have leakages and then we have injections. And so that brings us to this guy right here, NT, net taxes. So net taxes equals taxes minus transfer payments. If you haven't already, I would definitely have a formula list going here for Unit 2. And then this gives us what we call a household's disposable income. So disposable income is their aggregate income, or GDP, minus net taxes. So another formula, disposable income equals GDP minus net taxes. So these are the dollars that households have, and now they decide what to do with them. So let's go, I'll come back to this in a second. So let's talk a little bit more about the first half of the flow. So again, this model is showing us the flow of all income and spending in our economy. We do make some assumptions. The first assumption is that our capital that firms invest in, fleet vehicles, computers, machines, buildings, don't wear out. We know that's not true in reality, but we assume that. And we also assume that firms pay out all profits. They're not keeping any of those. So they're reinvesting everything or paying it out to their employees to buy more resources. Again, the bottom half is our income flow. And so it's the income coming from production. Remember, it's really important to note that GDP equals aggregate income, and then you need to know these two formulas. 1, net taxes equals taxes minus transfer payments. 2, disposable income equals GDP minus net taxes. And here's a third one. This is just really rearranging, though, number 2. So we also find then that GDP equals disposable income plus net taxes. All right, so let's continue on. Oh, sorry. So again, disposable income then for our households will be the income they have to either spend or save. And so we'll get to that in the second half of the flow. And this is after they've paid their taxes and then received any transfer payments. So some households will do both. They're going to both pay taxes and they're going to receive transfer payments. Okay. And again, we've already talked about net taxes. Okay. So now let's get to the expenditure portion of our flow. So once households have that disposable income, they have two options. They spend it, and so those dollars just continue on in this larger circle, but now we're in the expenditure portion of the flow, or they can save it. So savings is another example of a leakage. If we save it, that money goes to a financial market, think banks, credit unions, places like that. Well, what happens to the dollars with financial markets? Well, they get borrowed, primarily in 3 different ways. The first is investment spending by firms or investment spending by households on new construction. The second is government borrowing. So those investment spending dollars are then injected back into my expenditure portion of the flow. And you can see what we're doing here at the top. We are simply building out that expenditure formula for GDP that we talked about earlier in this chapter. So now let's talk about the government. Well, the government has some tax dollars. Now the government has some dollars from borrowing. So what do? Well, the government spends those dollars on goods and services. So that's the G portion of our GDP expenditure equation. And then finally, we have to talk about this upper right-hand corner here, the rest of the world, okay? So remember, our dollars are just flowing in this circle, right? If they leave the circle, they're a leakage. If they come back into the circle, they're an injection. Imports is when Americans buy foreign goods. So we pay with US dollars, so those dollars leave our economy. So that is imports are another example of a leakage. Whereas exports, when foreigners buy American goods, they pay with US dollars, and so those dollars are injections back into our flow, which then gives us net exports. Remember from earlier in the chapter, net exports is exports minus imports, which gives us GDP. Well, where do these dollars go? They're profits for the firm. What does the firm do with those profits? They turn around, they buy more resources from households. That becomes income for households, and we go around and around this circle. So another formula that we're going to need to know then is that disposable income equals consumption plus savings. And so it'll be important as we move through these chapters to remember that there's more than one way that these things are related. So let's say I give you some information and it's talking about disposable income. And you're like, oh yeah, disposable income equals GDP minus net taxes, right? That was our formula from the income flow. And you look at the information given, you're like, well, I can't figure this out. Well, that's probably because you forgot about the second relationship. So this is how we earn disposable income. And then this is what we do with it. We either spend it, consumption spending, or we save it in a financial market. So this is how we earn disposable income. And this is what do we do with it. Okay. Investments, remember that's borrowing dollars from those financial markets. So again, firms borrow it for new capital projects, new fleet vehicles, new construction, new computers, new equipment. Households borrow it for new residential construction. Again, government purchases is the G part. And then again, you have to know this formula for net exports, exports minus imports. So our financial markets, we'll talk more about banks and other financial institutions later in this course, but they really just are facilitators, okay? They facilitate the flow of funds from savers to borrowers. They charge interest in that process, so that's how banks make their profits. When we look at our total circular flow, we should see that leakages equal injections. So remember, injections are when dollars are going back into the circle, and it's done by all spending other than the household spending, and income other than from resource earnings. So investment, government purchases, exports, and transfer payments. These are all examples of our injections. Leakages then are any diversion of income from the domestic spending stream. And so those three are savings, taxes, and imports. So you need to make sure you know the differences between injections and leakages. So let's have a little question here to try to review some of this. So Amy moves from lower land, where she pays no taxes and receives no transfer payments, to upper land. She earns an annual salary of $30,000 in either country. But in upper land, she now has to pay taxes of $4,000, but she also receives transfer payments of $6,000. What is her disposable income in upper land? Okay, so again, in lower land, her disposable income, which remember is total income minus net taxes. Well, since there are no taxes or transfer payments, it's simply $30,000. So now we're trying to see how it differs in upper land. So in upper land, her disposable income, okay, well, her total income is still $30,000. So $30,000 minus her net taxes. So let's just calculate those separately. So net taxes is taxes minus transfer payments. Well, we're told she pays taxes of $4,000, but then she receives transfer payments of $6,000. So her net taxes are minus $2,000. So in upper land, Anne's disposable income, and I think I called her Amy earlier, sorry y'all, is $30,000 earned minus those net taxes of negative $2,000. Be so careful with your signs here, guys. So that becomes a positive, and so her disposable income in upper land is equal to $32,000. So comparing that to what she earned in lower land, what is our answer here? Our answer is C. Her disposable income increases by $2,000. So although she has to pay taxes now, Anne is actually better off. All right, guys, so that's all I have for the second part. Make sure you watch my first video on GDP and then the third video on Consumer Price Index, CPI, and that will round out Chapter 6 for us.